Saturday afternoons in Flaxborough were not famous for spectacle. They were, instead, noted for a species of collective politeness so steady that even the market pigeons seemed to coo more softly. The annual flower show held in the Draft Loyal Parish Hall since 1934 fitted this atmosphere perfectly. Hydrangeas, fuchsias, and the occasional experimental cactus lined the trestle tables like obedient troops. A brass urn hissed in the corner, dispensing tea with ecclesiastical slowness. Conversations drifted between praise for chrysanthemums and veiled criticism of judges' decisions. No one raised their voice above the hum of the electric heaters. Mrs. Enid Prowse had chosen a seat near the sponge cakes. She was a small, trim widow of 62, known in Gloucester Street for her punctual rent demands and her habit of peering through lace curtains as though compiling an unofficial census. Today she wore a pale mauve hat, trimmed with something that might once have been a violet. Her expression, ordinarily firm but not unfriendly, softened as she accepted a cup of tea from a Girl Guide volunteer and surveyed the scene. She was thinking, in the small-scale way of people who run lodging houses, about whether she had left the hallway gas fire too high. At that moment, a boy in a school blazer stooped beneath the cake stall and muttered something about lost property. He emerged empty-handed but left behind, just visible under the gingham tablecloth, a bulky paper-wrapped object tied with string. No one noticed until Mrs. Prowse, reaching for a slice of Battenberg, caught sight of it. She blinked once, twice, and then let out a small sound not unlike a teapot's first whistle. Her teacup trembled, tipped, and rolled away on the trestle. A second later, she sagged sideways, sliding off the wooden chair with a soft thud. The collapse produced a moment of stillness, followed by the sort of subdued commotion unique to respectable gatherings. Two ladies from the Women's Institute hurried forward. Someone fetched a chair. Someone else asked whether there was a doctor in the hall. Mrs. Prowse's hat rolled across the floor like a mauve wheel and came to rest against a potted begonia. She opened her eyes after only a few seconds, but refused, with a tight shake of the head, to look under the table. It was Mrs. Chubb, the vicar's wife, who crouched down and tugged at the parcel's string. The paper fell away to reveal a grotesque papier-mâché mask, the sort used in amateur pantomimes before health and safety rules banned flammable adhesives. It had been painted a chalky white with crimson lips and exaggerated brows. One of the eye holes had been ringed with gold paint, which lent it a curious leer. The effect in the muted light of the parish hall was that of a face grinning at its discoverers with antique spite. Mrs. Chubb gave a polite little "oh" and held it up for the company to see. A murmur travelled the hall. Some laughed nervously, supposing it a student prank. Others whispered about burglars, threats, or worse. The girl guide who had served tea began to giggle uncontrollably and had to be led away. All the while Mrs. Prowse, now seated again with her back stiff as a board, kept her eyes firmly on the opposite wall. Her normally brisk complexion had taken on a shade not found among the floral exhibits. Mr. Ellison, a retired postmaster with a sense of procedural duty, suggested ringing the police. Someone else pointed out that Inspector Pubright would likely be at the station until 5 and could pop round in due course. For the moment the mask was placed atop the cake stall like a macabre centrepiece. The jam tarts and scones looked distinctly uncomfortable beside it. As the incident settled into the peculiar half-life of village scandal, people began interpreting what they had seen. Mrs. Prowse had fainted dead away at the sight of a parcel, which must mean she knew who had sent it. Or perhaps she was acting, always had a dramatic streak, that one. A man near the tea urn ventured that it might be connected to that unpleasantness with her late husband's theatricals, but was promptly hushed by his wife. Each whispered theory carried a whiff of long-stored gossip released into the air like mothballs. Meanwhile, Mrs. Prowse regained enough composure to insist, in a voice clipped but low, that she would be leaving at once. She declined the offer of an ambulance and rose with dignity, hat retrieved and repinned. "A little dizziness," she said to no one in particular. Her handbag trembled slightly as she clutched it. With 2 brisk steps she reached the door, then paused to glance, involuntarily, at the mask on the stall. The look that crossed her face was not mere distaste, but something nearer recognition, and perhaps fear. Outside, the sky hung heavy with a coming drizzle. Mrs. Prowse walked quickly down the steps and into Gloucester Street, her shoes clicking on the wet paving stones. Behind her, inside the hall, a slow conversation began about who should store the mask until the police arrived. It was finally wrapped again in its paper and placed in the broom cupboard. Between a mop and a box of raffle tickets, Mrs. Chubb locked the door, though she was not sure why. Thus the flower show continued. Hydrangeas judged, buns eaten, certificates handed out, but with a tremor running beneath the surface like a current under calm water. People glanced at the broom cupboard as though it might emit a noise. The girl guide returned, subdued, to pour tea. Mr. Ellison took names for a statement, just in case. Yet the ordinary rhythm of Flaxborough asserted itself. The brass urn hissed. A baby cried. Someone announced the winner of the Dahlia section. Only a few noticed that the empty chair by the cake stall remained unoccupied for the rest of the afternoon, a small gap in the arrangement of genteel normality. Fewer still observed that Mrs. Prowse, usually the first to volunteer for clearing up, was not there when the trestle tables were folded away. But everyone would remember and repeat in their own version how the widow of Gloucester Street had turned pale at a mask and nearly toppled into the begonias. By evening the story had begun its journey through Flaxborough's parlours and pubs, growing stranger with each retelling, like a seed planted in the very soil of the town's imagination. By 3:30 the chrysanthemum certificates had been pinned up, the parish hall swept of petals, and the mask locked behind its broom cupboard door. By 4 o'clock, however, the event had already ceased to belong to those who had witnessed it. It had passed, as all Flaxborough incidents must, into the capable custody of the town's gossip network, a system more efficient than the telephone exchange and less prone to line noise. The first relay took place at the railway buffet, a narrow tiled refuge between platform 1 and the waiting room. Here, amid the smell of hot milk and damp mackintoshes, commuters, shoppers and idlers rubbed shoulders with the day's news. Mrs. Prowse's faint had been conveyed by a girl guide to her mother, by the mother to a neighbour on the bus, and by the neighbour to Mr. Spilthorpe, the ticket clerk, who now retold it to a knot of regulars at the counter. In his version, the parcel had been a bloodied animal head hidden under the cake stall, though he admitted, with a show of modesty, that this detail might be an exaggeration or two. The listeners accepted it with relish. Blood, after all, lent dignity to an otherwise tame happening. One man in a bowler suggested a connection to pagan rituals. Another, more practically minded, said it was probably some student's rag week joke. Meanwhile, at the far table under the no loitering sign, Miss Cribb from the haberdashery counter leaned over her tea to confide to Miss Fells, postmistress, retired, that the whole thing was a warning from beyond the grave, Mrs. Prowse's late husband having been not quite right, theatrically speaking. Miss Fells, whose hearing was poor but whose imagination was strong, nodded solemnly and repeated the story to a youth in a duffel coat, who carried it to the tobacconist across the road within minutes. Thus the tale gained size and weight, like a snowball pushed down a long hill. In one retelling, the mask was cursed. In another, it had been delivered by a man in a black car. In yet another, Mrs. Prowse had screamed an incriminating name before collapsing. Each storyteller emphasized the element that best suited their temperament. The pious stressed judgment. The envious hinted at scandal. The merely bored added colour, like amateur decorators with too much paint. Across town at the municipal offices, Councillor Harbottle had heard a less lurid but no less tendentious version. To him, the incident was a disgraceful hoax committed by Mr. Jeremy Kitteridge, an art teacher known for his daubs of macabre nonsense. Harbottle saw an opportunity to demonstrate both moral vigilance and control of public funds. Before the tea break was over, he had drafted a short statement for the evening paper deploring antics unworthy of our civic traditions. In the snug of the Three Swans public house, however, a more romantic theory prevailed. According to Mr. Beasley, a bus driver with a taste for melodrama, the mask was part of a lover's quarrel gone theatrical. "Widow like her," he told the barmaid, "bound to have secrets. Probably some bloke she threw out and now he's back," making a point. This was nodded at knowingly by several men who had never rented a room in Gloucester Street but felt competent to discuss its moral geography. All the while, Mrs. Prowse herself sat behind drawn curtains at number 14 Gloucester Street, staring at a slice of uneaten sponge cake on a plate. She had switched off the wireless and bolted the front door. The lodgers, accustomed to her bustling presence, whispered among themselves in the hallway, piecing together rumours from the town and deciding which version of the story would be safest to repeat at supper. Sergeant Malley, cycling back from an errand, noticed the glow of a single lamp in her front parlour and made a mental note. He had been in the parish hall only briefly and had missed the fainting altogether. What he knew came from Mrs. Chubb's description at the vicarage, which included the phrase "poor soul nearly perished." Malley, who liked facts solid and small, wondered what the inspector would make of it. Inspector Pubright, for his part, had yet to hear the full tale. It reached him only indirectly as a constable's half-hearted query about a bit of business at the flower show. Pubright glanced at the incident sheet, noted the absence of any crime beyond unidentified article, and said nothing. Years of Flaxborough policing had taught him that premature conclusions were like hasty puddings, liable to collapse under their own steam. Back in the buffet, the story continued to evolve. Mr. Spilthorpe now recalled with an air of injured memory that the mask's eyes had glowed red, though whether with paint or fire he could not say. Miss Cribb's friend, Miss Fells, claimed she had seen the very same thing years ago during a church hall rehearsal. The youth in the duffel coat drew a crude sketch on his newspaper for illustration. It bore only the remotest resemblance to the actual object, but was passed around with murmurs of recognition. By the time the 5:10 train to Eastfield pulled out, carrying several rumour-laden passengers, the widow's fright had become an accepted fact of local life, like the leaning lamppost on Market Hill or the missing apostrophe in the grocer's sign. No one could agree on what the mask meant, but everyone agreed it meant something. Thus, before Inspector Pubright had so much as stepped into Gloucester Street, the case had acquired suspects, motives, and a faint air of moral instruction, all spun from the threadbare cloth of hearsay. Only the mask itself, still locked in the broom cupboard of the parish hall, remained silent and unchanged, waiting for the official gaze to fall upon it. Inspector Pubright approached the matter as he did all matters, not with sirens, but with a gentle peddling of thought. On Monday morning he arrived at the station in a brown overcoat that had been brushed but not renewed, nodded to the desk sergeant, and sat down to read the weekend reports. The widow's fright incident appeared as a slim file between abandoned bicycle High Street and noise complaint, Lower Market. It contained a single sheet of lined paper on which Sergeant Malley had written, "With schoolboy clarity, papier-mâché mask found beneath cake stall at flower show. Mrs. Enid Prowse, widow, Gloucester Street, fainted on sight. Mask secured in parish hall broom cupboard. No further disturbance." Pubright read it twice, then folded the page and tucked it back without comment. Sergeant Malley, who had hovered helpfully nearby, interpreted this silence as a sign of latent interest. Odd thing, sir, he ventured. Bit theatrical for Flaxborough, wouldn't you say? Pubright looked up mildly. People do like to express themselves, Mally. Sometimes with flowers, sometimes with papier-mâché. He reached for his hat. Shall we pay a call? Mrs. Enid Prowse's lodging house occupied the middle of a short terrace in Gloucester Street, a road of bowed front doors and modest respectability. The houses leaned slightly as though listening to each other's conversations. At number 14, the brass letter plate bore a discreet rooms vacant card pushed halfway across it, like a hand raised for privacy. Pubright pressed the bell. From within came the faint sound of a wireless tuned low to the home service. The door opened after a pause. Mrs. Prowse stood framed in the dim hallway light, hatless and paler than she had been at the flower show. Her manner suggested a hostess obliged to greet an unexpected but inevitable guest. Pubright introduced himself and Mally with quiet formality. She hesitated, then stepped back to admit them. The front parlour smelt faintly of coal dust and lavender polish. Photographs of seaside holidays, indistinct, wind-blown, lined the mantel. A clock with brass feet ticked at a pace that seemed determined not to hurry. Mrs. Prowse gestured to the horsehair sofa. "I'm afraid I can only offer tea," she said. "I'm not much for spirits in the morning." Her voice was firm but dry, like a page turned cautiously. Pubright accepted the tea with thanks and allowed her to sit opposite. Mally balanced on the edge of an armchair, notebook ready but unopened. The inspector asked only one question to begin. "You were unwell at the flower show, Mrs. Prowse?" She clasped her hands in her lap. A little faintness. It was very warm. "I'm perfectly recovered. I'm glad to hear it." Pubright stirred his tea slowly, eyes on the spoon. "The parcel under the cake stall, but you had not seen it before?" Her fingers tightened slightly. No, I had not." She spoke the words carefully, like someone testing floorboards. Mally, eager to help, said, "It gave you quite a turn, though." Mrs. Prowse looked at him with the faintest flicker of annoyance. "I was surprised, Sergeant. Anyone would have been." Pubright glanced at the photographs on the mantelpiece. One showed a man in amateur theatrical costume, a powdered wig and a painted mask held jauntily to one side. Without pointing to it, he asked, "Your late husband enjoyed the stage?" Her eyes shifted to the picture. "He did a little acting." "Local things." "Charity entertainments." She gave a short laugh that held no amusement. "All very long ago. Do you keep any of his costumes?" Pubright's tone was gentle, conversational. "No, I sold them." "Years back." "To a dealer?" She paused. "Or perhaps I gave some to the church jumble." "I don't recall exactly." Pubright nodded as though she had mentioned a misplaced umbrella. "And your lodgers? How many at present?" "3. Mr. Simmons, a retired tax clerk. Miss Lee, a dressmaker. Mr. Pell, a security guard at the gas works. All respectable people. I'm sure they are." Pubright set down his cup. "Have you had any difficulties with them?" She hesitated a moment too long. "No difficulties. Only ordinary matters of rent." Mally wrote nothing but looked up with the air of someone seeing a hook without knowing the bait. Pubright rose, adjusting his coat. "You've been very kind to see us, Mrs. Prowse. Perhaps, if you don't mind, we'll collect the mask from the parish hall and bring it round for you to identify. It may help to settle the matter." Her hands fluttered once, then folded again. "I'd rather not see it, Inspector." Pubright's expression remained mild. "Quite understandable, but a routine step. We'll arrange a convenient time." He inclined his head. "Good morning." Back on the pavement, Mally exhaled. "She's frightened of something, sir." "Or of someone," Pubright said. He set off at an unhurried pace. "It's early yet." They walked toward the parish hall, boots clicking on damp stones. Pubright asked about the broom cupboard key and whether the mask had been moved. Mally reported that Mrs. Chubb had kept it under lock and key like a relic of saints. Pubright said only "good" and quickened his stride slightly, as though the morning had become marginally more interesting. Inside the hall, the scent of flowers had faded, leaving only cold wood and cleaning fluid. The broom cupboard door yielded with a squeak. The mask lay inside its paper like a sleeping face. Pubright lifted it by the string and turned it gently in the light from the high window. The crimson lips, the gold-ringed eye-hole, the chalk-white paint, all faintly cracked with age. He examined the back, where a scrap of paper adhered under old glue. Without comment, he eased it loose and slipped it into his pocket. Malley craned his neck. "Something there, sir?" "A label," Pubright said lightly. "A fragment of some program, perhaps. We'll see later." They left the hall and walked back into the grey morning. The town moved at its usual tempo, milk cart rattling, shop shutters rising. Yet Purbright's gaze held the distant focus of Ammon watching a play unfold from the back row. He said nothing more until they reached the station, where he placed the mask on his desk as one might place a guest in a waiting room. Then he opened the file and wrote a single line. "Inquiries continue." Malley, still standing, cleared his throat. "What do you think, sir?" Pubright reached for his tea. "I think, Malley, that we've been offered the opening scene of a little drama. It would be rude to leave before the interval." By Tuesday morning, Flaxborough had achieved what it always achieved after an unusual occurrence, a neat theory to restore civic order. The theory arrived, fully clothed and opinionated, in the person of Councillor Edgar Harbottle, chairman of the Flower Show Committee and self-appointed guardian of public decorum. Harbottle possessed a girth that lent his pronouncements weight and a moustache that quivered with righteousness. He had already telephoned the Flaxborough Chronicle before breakfast to offer a statement. Now, fortified by a second round of toast at the civic offices, he prepared to address the police. Sergeant Malley, sent ahead by Pubright, found Harbottle dictating to his secretary. "The deplorable outrage upon our cherished tradition of floral excellence," the councillor declaimed, "and I have every confidence in the authorities," put that in capitals, Miss Dent, "to apprehend the miscreant responsible." He signed the sheet with a flourish. "There, that will reassure the public." Malley cleared his throat. "Inspector Pubright asked if you'd spare a few minutes, sir." Of course," Harbottle boomed, as though granting an audience. "Bring him in." Pubright entered at his usual unhurried pace, hat in hand, expression polite to the point of opacity. "Good morning, Councillor." "Inspector." Harbottle rose half an inch from his chair. "I trust you're making progress. We cannot have this kind of tomfoolery sullying the town's reputation. We're making inquiries," Pubright said. "May I sit?" Harbottle gestured grandly. "By all means." "I imagine you've already formed your conclusions." "Not yet." "Well, I have," Harbottle said with satisfaction. "Jeremy Kittredge, art master at the Technical College, known for ghastly jokes and indecent collages. Only last term he staged a so-called installation involving a stuffed fox and a bicycle pump. Caused a stir in the mayor's parlour. The man thrives on notoriety." Pubright inclined his head. "And your information about his involvement in the mask incident?" "Common sense," Harbottle declared. "Who else would dream up a grotesque mask to frighten a respectable widow? Disgraceful prank to draw attention to himself. You'll find the thing was made in his classroom, mark my words." Malley, who had been taking notes in his earnest copperplate, looked up. "We've heard similar, sir. Several townspeople mentioned Kittredge. There you are." Harbottle thumped the desk. "Consensus. All you need is to act. The public expects it." Pubright folded his hat on his knee. "Mr. Kittredge may indeed be capable of eccentricities. But eccentricity, even combined with poor taste, does not necessarily constitute a motive." Harbottle's moustache bristled. "You mean to tell me you're not going to question him?" "I shall, of course," Pubright said mildly. "It would be discourteous not to. But I prefer evidence to expectation." The councillor exhaled noisily like a kettle nearing boil. "Inspector, this town cannot afford dithering. The Chronicle will be running my statement tomorrow. The public believes the culprit identified." Pubright gave a small smile that might have been sympathy. "The public is often ahead of events, and sometimes behind them." He rose. "Thank you for your time." As they walked back to the station, Malley said, "He does have a point, sir. Kittredge is a bit of a one." "I remember that fox and bicycle pump." "Yes, Malley," Pubright said, watching a pigeon flap across the square. But you will also recall that the fox belonged to the mayor's brother-in-law. When Kitteridge returned it with an apology, no harm done. Mischief, not malice. Mally hesitated. Still, the mask was pretty nasty. Indeed. Purbright's tone held no argument, only patience. Let's see what Mr. Kitteridge has to say. They found the art master in his classroom at the Technical College, a draughty red brick building smelling of plaster dust and tempera paint. Jeremy Kitteridge was a tall man in corduroy with hair that sprang outward as though in protest. He welcomed them with theatrical surprise. "Gentlemen of the law," he exclaimed, wiping clay from his fingers. "What can I possibly have done to merit your august presence?" Pubright introduced himself and Mally, then looked around the room. Masks, pots, and curious assemblages lined the shelves like relics from a tribe of irreverent gods. "We're inquiring about a papier-mâché mask left at the parish hall on Saturday," Pubright said. "Some people think you may know something about it." Kitteridge laughed, a high, cheerful sound. My reputation precedes me. No, Inspector, not guilty. Though I admire the craftsmanship. Whoever made it had a fine eye for menace. You didn't supply such a mask to anyone? Certainly not. My students are still at the stage of gluing their fingers together. That mask, from what I read in the paper, was vintage. He tilted his head. Why has someone fainted? Mrs. Enid Prowse, Mally supplied. Kitteridge's eyebrows rose. The landlady? Lodged a student of mine once? Complained he left charcoal smudges on her stair carpet. Terrifying woman, he smiled. But no, Inspector, much as I would relish adding to Flaxborough's legends, I can claim no authorship of your mystery. Pubright regarded him for a moment. You seem amused by the incident. I'm an art teacher in a provincial town, Kitteridge said with a shrug. One must take one's entertainment where one finds it. But truly, I know nothing. Pubright thanked him and left a card. If anything occurs to you... Delighted, Kitteridge said, returning to a sculpture of what looked like a lobster in a bowler hat. Back at the station, Mally perched on his chair. He seemed genuine, sir. Possibly, Pubright said. He laid the mask on his desk again. Or possibly he's a better actor than artist. We'll see, Mally flicked through his notes. You don't think Harbottle's right, then? I think Harbottle enjoys being right, Pubright replied, lighting a slow cigarette. That's not quite the same thing. Outside the window, the town moved at its usual pace, buses sighing, pigeons shifting on the ledge, a drizzle threatening. Inside, the inspector sat with his thoughts unspoken, the mask grinning faintly from the blotter like a face from an old playbill. Wednesday morning brought a thin, colourless sunlight that made the parish hall look more like a disused warehouse than the pride of Flaxborough's community life. Inspector Pubright arrived without ceremony, his coat collar turned up against a damp breeze. He had telephoned ahead to say he would call about some chairs, a phrase that reassured Mrs. Chubb, the vicar's wife and de facto custodian, far more than any mention of masks or investigations would have done. She met him at the side entrance, keys jingling on a long ribbon. You'll find everything exactly as it was, Inspector, she said. I locked the cupboard myself. No one else has had the key, Pubright smiled. I'm sure you have been most careful, Mrs. Chubb. If you wouldn't mind showing me. They walked through the hall, now stripped of floral exhibits and echoing with the smell of polish. A few stray petals clung to the floorboards like confetti after an under-attended wedding. The broom cupboard stood at the far end, a stout wooden door with a brass latch. Mrs. Chubb opened it and stood aside. There you are. Inside the narrow space, the mask lay on an upturned crate, wrapped again in its paper. Mops and brooms leaned against the wall like sentries. Pubright stepped in, stooping slightly, and reached for the parcel. He opened it with the same deliberate care he might have given to an old letter. The mask emerged chalk-white and crimson as before, its expression unchanged but somehow more intimate in the dim light. He turned it over in his hands, thumb tracing the cracked paint, eyes half-lidded as if listening rather than looking. On the inside, a small, yellowing scrap of paper clung to the dried glue, It was no larger than a matchbox and printed in a bold, slightly archaic typeface. Pubright eased it loose with a fingernail. The fragment read only "Gull" and part of a date, June 19th. But that was enough. He recognized the style at once. It belonged to the Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic and Operatic Society, dissolved 25 years ago after a scandal involving missing funds and an unfinished production of The Masked Lover. He slipped the scrap into his pocket without comment, still holding the mask as though nothing had changed. "A fine piece of work," he said aloud, addressing no one in particular. "Well made."
"Very durable." Mrs. Chubb peered in, but saw only the mask.
"Ghastly thing, if you ask me." "Yes," Pubright murmured. "Durable and ghastly. Not a common combination." He rewrapped the mask neatly and set it back on the crate. "Would you be so kind, Mrs. Chubb, as to tell me about the chairs stored here? I understand the flower show committee borrowed some last week." She blinked. "The chairs, Inspector?" "Yes, I'm trying to get an idea of foot traffic."
"How often people come and go?" "Oh, well, the Brownies used some for their pageant."
"And Mr. Harbottle had a few sent to the town hall for his committee meeting. They'll be back Friday." "Excellent." Pubright smiled as if chairs were the heart of his inquiry. "You've been most helpful." He left the cupboard, dusting his hands lightly. Mrs. Chubb locked it again with a decisive snap. "You think it was one of those students, after all?" she asked, as they walked back toward the door. "I try not to think until I have to," Pubright said.
"It only wears the furniture." Mrs. Chubb gave a polite laugh, uncertain if it was a joke.
He thanked her and stepped outside into the chill air. Across the square, Sergeant Malley waited with a notebook under his arm. "Find anything, sir?" "Some dust, some chairs," Pubright said mildly. "Also a scrap of paper." "We'll have a look later," Malley brightened.
"A clue?"
"Perhaps. Or perhaps just history shedding its skin." He set off down the pavement.
"Tell me about that old drama society, Malley."
"Do we still have their records?" "Think so. Something in the borough archive. Why?" "Idle curiosity," Malley grinned. "You never are idle, sir." Purbright's eyes twinkled briefly. "And let's not spoil my reputation." They passed the newsagent, whose window displayed the Flaxborough Chronicle headline, "Police on Trail of Mask Prankster." Beneath it, a photograph of Councillor Harbottle radiated civic resolve. Malley pointed at it.
"Looks like the town's already decided." "Yes," Pubright said.
"The town is efficient that way. Sometimes it even gets things right." At the station, he laid the mask in an evidence box with no label, then took out the paper scrap and smoothed it on his blotter. The print was unmistakable. A memory stirred. A council meeting in 1940-something, whispers of misappropriated costume funds, a hasty dissolution. People involved had dispersed or reinvented themselves. But motives, Pubright reflected, seldom expired with committees. They lingered like props in a storeroom, waiting for the next performance. He tucked the scrap into an envelope and wrote nothing on it.
Malley hovered.
"Want me to check old newspapers?" "Not yet," Pubright said. "First, let's find out who borrowed which chairs." Malley blinked.
"Chairs, sir?"
"Chairs can be very revealing," Pubright said with a faint smile. "They're like witnesses. They turn up where they're needed." He reached for the telephone.
"Get me the town hall." While the line rang, he leaned back, eyes on the mask.
It grinned faintly under the desk lamp, still and patient. Pubright thought of Mrs. Prowse's pale face and her careful denial. He thought of Harbottle's eagerness to supply a villain, of Kitteridge's theatrical shrug, and of a scrap of paper, older than many of the town's grudges, clinging like a ghost inside a mask. He spoke into the receiver. "Good morning, Mrs. Dent. Inspector Pubright here. Could you tell me exactly how many chairs Councillor Harbottle borrowed last week?" The voice at the other end hesitated, then began to list numbers. Pubright listened, pen idle, a small inward smile forming as though a detail had quietly aligned with another. Gloucester Street possessed the kind of quiet in which curtains spoke more than people. Its terrace houses leaned toward each other like old friends with unfinished gossip, and every doorstep bore the same faint imprint of generations' worth of polish. To outsiders it might have looked a row of interchangeable lives. To Inspector Pubright, walking slowly down its pavement on Thursday morning, each number was a footnote in the town's social text. He had arranged, under the pretext of routine neighbourhood checks, to meet Mrs. Prowse's current lodgers. Sergeant Malley followed a step behind, notebook at the ready but eyes slightly wary. "3 of them, sir?" he asked. "Seems a bit cramped." "Cramped quarters often produce interesting harmonies," Pubright murmured, "or discords." The first to receive them was Mr. Simmons, a retired tax clerk whose clothes still bore the meek smell of ledger ink. He answered the door of his ground-floor room with an air of someone summoned to a formal audit. "Inspector? Oh dear."
Have I done something wrong?
His voice trembled like a page in a draft. "Not at all," Pubright said kindly. "We're simply making some routine inquiries about Saturday's incident."
May we step in?
The room was neat to the point of apology, every newspaper squared, every teaspoon parallel. Simmons gestured them to 2 armless chairs and perched himself on the edge of the bed.
I saw nothing, Inspector. I only heard about it later. Pubright folded his hands.
"You've lodged with Mrs. Prowse long?" 7 years. Simmons's eyes flickered to the ceiling. "Ever since my wife passed." "Quiet life," he hesitated. "Though she, Mrs. Prowse, is rather particular." "In what way?" Pubright's tone was mild. "Oh, nothing improper," Simmons said quickly. "Just strict about rent dates, guests, and so on. A lady has her standards." He coughed. "We did have a misunderstanding once over a gas bill, but that's behind us." "Of course." Pubright rose. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. You've been very helpful." As they stepped into the hallway,
Malley whispered.
he looked scared of his own shadow. "Sometimes shadows have long memories," Pubright said. Next was Miss Lee, the dressmaker. Her upstairs room resembled a haberdashery shipwreck, bolts of cloth leaning against the walls, spools rolling like small wheels across the carpet. She wore a tape measure round her neck like a medal and greeted them with brisk suspicion. "If this is about that mask business, I've told everyone already. I had nothing to do with it." "We're not accusing you of anything," Pubright assured her. "Merely trying to understand the household." "Well, understand this," she said, planting her hands on her hips.
I'm owed 2 weeks' sewing money from Mrs. Prowse, alterations on curtains.
Promised me she'd pay after the flower show. Then she goes fainting over parcels instead. Convenient, Malley blinked. "You think she pretended to faint?"
I didn't say that. Miss Lee drew herself up.
"But some people like a bit of drama. Her late husband was the same. Costumes, secrets, all that nonsense. If you ask me, it's catching," Pubright asked softly. "Did you ever see any of his costumes?" "Bits and pieces years back."
Masks in a trunk.
She claimed she'd sold them, but I've seen one in her cupboard since. Couldn't mistake it, red lips like a circus clown.
I was dusting the landing, she sniffed.
"Of course, she told me I'd imagined it." "That must have been frustrating," Pubright said. Miss Lee's mouth tightened.
I do my work, Inspector. I like things straight.
"That's all." He thanked her, stepping carefully over a fallen spool on the way out. In the hallway, Malley murmured,
"She's sharper than her needles," and pricked.
"Perhaps," Pubright replied. The third lodger occupied the back room overlooking a yard where a single washing line sagged under grey towels. Mr. Pell was a broad man with a policeman's upright stance, though the uniform he now wore bore the badge of the Gasworks Security Service. He greeted Pubright with a nod that mixed deference and challenge.
"Inspector, Sergeant, Mr. Pell," Pubright said pleasantly. "I understand you once served in the police?"
15 years, Pell said, left on my own terms. "Security pays better." His eyes flicked to Malley's notebook. "What's this about?" "We're inquiring into the mask found at the flower show," Pubright said. Mrs. Prowse was distressed. Pell's expression remained neutral. "So I heard."
"I wasn't there. Saturday nights I'm on shift. Did you ever know her husband?"
"Only by sight.
Amdram chap."
All wigs and grease paint. Didn't like the cut of me, I suppose." Pubright smiled faintly.
And you of him?
Didn't matter. People have their hobbies. Pell folded his arms. Look, Inspector, I keep myself to myself.
Pay my rent on time.
She's got trouble with a mask, nothing to do with me. Mally, trying to sound casual, asked, She's strict with you too? Pell gave a short laugh. She's strict with everyone.
Keeps this place like a barracks.
Suits me fine.
Some lodgers don't like it.
That's their problem. Pubright studied him a moment longer, then said, Thank you, Mr. Pell, we won't keep you. As they left the yard, Mally muttered, Ex-police, late husband's costumes, unpaid curtain money. All a bit cosy, sir? Purbright's eyes followed a cat slipping under the gate. Cosy households can conceal cold draughts, Mally. They walked back toward the station. Behind them, Gloucester Street resumed its careful quiet, but the air seemed faintly charged, like a stage before a second act. At the corner, Pubright paused, looking up at the windows of number 14. Each lodger, he thought, carried a private grievance like a pin in a cushion. Too small to see, but sharp enough when pressed. Mrs. Prowse, for her part, had retreated behind lace and bolted doors, yet the playbill scrap in his pocket linked her present distress to an older drama. Do you think one of them's trying to scare her?
Mally asked. Possibly, Pubright said.
But people rarely frighten others without first trying to reassure themselves. We'll keep listening. He set off at his steady pace, leaving Gloucester Street to its curtains and quiet rivalries, and already considering whom to visit next. Friday dawned damp and pewter-coloured, the sort of morning when even pigeons seemed reluctant to flutter. Yet by 8 o'clock Flaxborough had a new spectacle to discuss, one that drew passers-by to the town hall steps as if to a street performance. The bronze statue of Sir Godfrey Tuttle, alderman, philanthropist, and, according to local myth, the man who brought Maine's drainage to the borough, now wore a mask. Not the chalky theatre face of the flower show, but a far more grotesque creation, green-painted with a hooked nose, blackened lips and horns fashioned from rolled paper, stiffened with glue. It stared down from the plinth like an evil jester presiding over civic virtue. A milkman making his deliveries was first to notice. He set down his crate and whistled softly. Well, Sir Godfrey, you've joined the circus, he said to no one in particular. By the time the town hall clock struck 8:30, a crowd had gathered. Office clerks, shoppers, 2 bus drivers on their break, and a small detachment of schoolchildren stared up, commenting with relish. Someone fetched a camera.
Someone else fetched their mother.
The second mask, in its impudence, had done what the first had not, turned Flaxborough gossip into a spectator sport. At precisely 9, Councillor Harbottle arrived, breathing heavily and armed with indignation.
Outrage,
he barked, pushing through the onlookers. Desecration of public property. He shook his umbrella at the statue, as if threatening to jab the mask off himself. Where are the police? Where is Inspector Pubright? His secretary, Miss Dent, murmured that she had telephoned the station. Good, Harbottle snapped. This is the thin end of the wedge. First flower shows, now civic monuments. Next they'll be gluing horns on the mayor. Across the square, at the police station window, Sergeant Mally watched the scene. Another mask, sir, he called over his shoulder. Right in front of the town hall. Looks like a proper one, too. Inspector Pubright rose from his desk, adjusted his tie, and joined Mally at the window. His expression, if anything, was mildly reflective, as though considering a curious item in a shop window. More elaborate than the first, he remarked. Somebody's improving with practice, Mally turned to him.
Shall we get it down? Public nuisance and all. In due course, Pubright said.
Let the town enjoy its matinee. We might learn more from the audience than the stage. He reached for his hat.
Come along, Sergeant.
We'll take a stroll. By the time they reached the plinth, the crowd had thickened. Comments floated like confetti. Definitely that art teacher this time, said one man. Looks like something from them horror films, said a woman clutching a shopping bag. A youth with a camera insisted it was performance art and should be preserved for posterity. Children giggled, imitating the mask's horns with their fingers. Pubright moved quietly among them, noting who lingered, who whispered, who photographed. He paused beside a thin woman in a headscarf who said to her companion, "Mark my words, this is about that widow in Gloucester Street." The companion nodded sagely. "Reckon she's got enemies." Sergeant Malley craned up at the mask. "You're right, sir. Much nastier than the first. Took some work to get it up there overnight." "Indeed," Pubright murmured, "especially without being seen." He looked across the square at the town hall's side entrance. "A key would help." Harbottle spotted them and bore down like an irate tugboat.
"Inspector!"
"This has gone far enough. The town demands action. You must arrest Kitteridge immediately." Pubright inclined his head politely. "Good morning, Councillor."
"You're up early?" "I haven't slept," Harbottle thundered.
"Public order is at stake. Think of the tourists." "I am thinking of them," Pubright said mildly. "They seemed quite entertained." He glanced at the group of schoolchildren taking turns for photographs. "And no doubt the Chronicle will have a splendid front page." Harbottle's moustache bristled. "You're making light of it." "I prefer to make notes." Pubright produced a small notebook and jotted without looking. "Tell me, Councillor, how many chairs did you borrow from the parish hall last week?" Harbottle blinked. "Chairs? What on earth?"
"A dozen, I believe. Why?"
"Merely an inventory matter," Pubright said. "Enjoy your morning?" He moved away before Harbottle could recover. Malley followed, suppressing a grin. "You do like to rattle him, sir." "I like to see what falls off the shelf," Pubright replied. They stopped at a bench opposite the statue. Pubright watched the crowd ebb and flow, as if the square itself were breathing.
"Notice anything, Malley?"
"Plenty of talk, sir."
"Everyone's sure it's Kitteridge." "Yes, and yet the mask is older in style."
Hand-painted with patience. "Our Mr. Kitteridge favours speed and shock," Malley frowned. "So you think it's not him?" "I think the town has become too tidy in its theories," Pubright said. "When that happens, reality tends to misbehave." He stood and walked across to the plinth. With an unhurried reach, he lifted the mask from Sir Godfrey's head. Up close it smelt faintly of attic dust and old glue. Inside, where no one else had looked, a small penciled 2 marked the inner rim. Purbright's brows moved a fraction. He replaced the mask as it was, stepped down, and dusted his hands. Malley whispered, "You're leaving it there." "For now, it's an exhibit in progress. Sometimes it's better to let a play run until the second act's over." He looked up at Sir Godfrey's bronze face behind the mask. "Besides, whoever placed it may wish to admire their handiwork. We'll give them the chance." They strolled back toward the station, leaving Harbottle spluttering at reporters and townspeople craning for a better view. Purbright's pace remained measured, his gaze inward. The second mask had shifted the affair from prank to pattern. A 25-year-old scrap of paper, a widow's faint, 3 lodgers with grievances, and now a numbered mask on a civic statue. In his office he set his hat on the peg and stood for a moment, looking out at the square. The crowd still milled. The horns still jutted skyward. Pubright poured himself a cup of tea and spoke half to himself. "Patterns, Malley.
They're shy creatures."
You have to let them settle before they show their markings." Malley, standing at the door, nodded slowly. "Right, sir. So we just watch?" "For now." Pubright smiled faintly. "Flaxborough is very good at stewing. Let's see what rises to the surface." Dusk arrived early in Flaxborough that evening, as though a grey curtain had been drawn across the town. The windows of the police station reflected street lamps trembling in the drizzle, and the square outside lay nearly empty except for Sir Godfrey Tuttle's statue, still wearing its grotesque second mask. Inside, the hum of the day had faded. Telephones slept, and only the occasional scrape of a chair or murmur from the duty desk disturbed the hush. Inspector Pubright sat alone in his office. The room was modest. 2 filing cabinets, a serviceable desk, and a single armchair worn smooth by visitors. The desk lamp cast a small circle of amber light over papers arranged with deliberate untidiness. On the blotter lay 2 items, the envelope containing the scrap of playbill paper and a small sheaf of notes in Purbright's spare handwriting. Outside the circle of light, the mask sat in its box like a coiled thought. He had spent much of the afternoon with Mally in the borough archives, retrieving files that smelled of coal smoke and old ink. Now, with the station quiet, he leafed through them at his own pace. Council minutes from 1948 recorded the temporary suspension of the Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic and Operatic Society. The entry was terse but suggestive. Irregularities in accounts, costumes to be stored pending disposal. No names given, but Pubright knew names had a way of hiding in footnotes. He cross-checked a tenancy register from the same period. 3 addresses on Gloucester Street appeared, repeatedly as correspondence for the Society's costumes, one of them belonging to the late Mr. Prowse. Another had once been occupied by a Mr. Pell before his police service. The third belonged to a dressmaker whose surname matched Miss Lee's maiden name. A faint smile touched Purbright's mouth. Coincidences, he thought, were rarely so polite. He leaned back and allowed his gaze to wander around the room. In small towns, he mused, scandal did not disappear. It simply grew new curtains. People adjusted the story to spare themselves embarrassment or to sharpen it for others. Over time, motives hardened like plaster, yet the outlines of old events persisted underneath. The masks of the present were often made from papier-mâché of the past. From the corridor drifted the scent of tea, long since cooled. Pubright picked up his fountain pen and began to write a short note on heavy paper. The address he formed at the top belonged to a discreet solicitor in Eastfield, a man known for neither speed nor indiscretion. The message itself was sparse, a request for copies of certain sale records connected with the disposal of theatrical properties in 1949. No hint of why the inspector wanted them. He blotted the ink carefully, folded the paper, and slipped it into an envelope without sealing it yet. He then turned back to the old council minutes. The handwriting of the clerk who had taken them was neat but faint. Suspension of treasurer pending inquiry. That line he underlined lightly with a pencil. Beside it he wrote a single initial, not for Mally's eyes, but for his own memory. The pages whispered as he turned them. The telephone on his desk remained silent. No progress reports from constables, no fresh theories from Councillor Harbottle, only the faint thrum of the building itself. Pubright preferred it this way. Thinking required quiet, and quiet was a rare commodity in Flaxborough once gossip began its rounds. He opened a second folder, this one containing rent rolls for number 14 Gloucester Street. Mrs. Prowse had indeed been strict with her tenants. Notations in different inks showed small disputes over deposits, furniture repairs and missing items. One entry, dated nearly a year ago, recorded a short tenancy by a young art student, one of Kitteridge's, perhaps, who had left abruptly after improper use of storage trunk. Pubright tapped the page with his pen, then set it aside. The student's name was not the one he expected, but it added another thread to the skein. For a moment, he let his eyes close. Outside, the square's lamplight made blurred patterns on the rain-streaked glass. Respectability, he reflected, was like those reflections, shimmering on the surface, distorting the shape beneath. People arranged their histories to fit the frame available, yet the past bled through at the edges. Masks and curtains, costumes and chairs, props in a play performed for one's neighbours. He opened the envelope with the scrap of playbill paper again, holding it to the lamp. The bold, archaic typeface glowed faintly. He imagined a performance long ago, a masked cast, perhaps a financial quarrel backstage. Who had kept the props? Who had feared discovery enough to frighten a widow decades later? He did not yet know, but the shape of the answer was emerging like a watermark. He reached for another sheet of paper and wrote a list of names without headings. Prowse, Simmons, Lee, Pell, Kitteridge, Harbottle. Then, after a pause, he added one more from the old minutes. Looking at the list, he felt a small shift, as if a chess piece had moved quietly on its own. A knock came at the door. Mally's head appeared. "Everything all right, sir? Thought you might want a sandwich." "Thank you, Mally, but no, I'm nearly done." Pubright closed the folders with slow care. "How's the square?" Still a crowd round the statue. Someone's brought a thermos, Councillor Harbottle's giving quotes to the paper. Purbright's mouth twitched. Excellent, let them stew a little longer. He waved the sergeant off and returned to his desk. He sealed the envelope to the solicitor and placed it on the corner of the blotter. Outside, the rain thickened. Inside, the lamp's circle of light remained steady. The inspector reached for his tea, found it cold, and smiled faintly. Patterns, he thought, were patient. So was he. The railway buffet at Flaxborough Station was a place where time held its breath between trains. Its tiled walls and wooden counter had changed little since the war, and the scent of boiled milk clung to the air like an old anecdote. At 3:30 on Saturday, Inspector Pubright entered with the same mild expression he wore when examining crime scenes. Sergeant Mally followed, though at a respectful distance, sensing the inspector's wish for privacy. At a corner table sat Mr. Pell, the former constable turned security guard, sipping tea from a thick mug and reading a discarded newspaper. His uniform jacket, unbuttoned, showed a man still accustomed to order, but no longer obliged to maintain it. Pubright ordered a pot of tea and 2 scones, then ambled across with a genial nod. "Mind if I join you, Mr. Pell? The seats seem shy this afternoon." Pell looked up, wary but polite. "Of course, Inspector. Didn't expect to see you here." "I like the buffet," Pubright said, settling opposite. "One overhears the most interesting things without meaning to." He poured tea with unhurried care. "How's the gasworks these days?" "Quiet," Pell said. "Nothing much to guard except valves. Suits me." "Valves are good," Pubright agreed. "They keep things under pressure from bursting." He buttered a scone and glanced at the newspaper. The headline still screamed about the masked statue. "You'll have seen our civic entertainment?" Pell gave a small grunt. "Hard to miss. Town's turned it into a picnic." "Flaxborough enjoys a spectacle," Pubright said mildly. "We've had 2 masks so far. One wonders whether we should expect a third." Pell shifted in his seat. "Wouldn't surprise me. People get bold once they've done something once." Pubright nodded, as though agreeing about the weather. "Do you know, Mr. Pell, I've been thinking about amateur dramatics. My wife—" He paused, remembering he had no wife, then continued without apology. "My late aunt, rather, once belonged to a society. Props and costumes everywhere. Hard to keep track. Did you ever go in for that sort of thing?" "Me?" Pell gave a short laugh. "No, Inspector. Policing's theatre enough." "Ah, yes. And yet your old lodging house was full of costumes, wasn't it? Mr. Prowse's trunk, all those masks." Pell's eyes flickered. "I suppose." "Curious objects," Pubright mused, stirring his tea. "One imagines they hold memories, and keys, of course, are always interesting. Did Mrs. Prowse keep the trunk locked?" Pell hesitated just a beat too long. "Most times, yes. Said it was her husband's things." "And who had the key?" "She did." Pell looked at his mug. "Said she didn't trust lodgers meddling." "Very prudent," Pubright said. "Although I've been told a student once borrowed something from it without permission." Pell's mouth tightened. "That was before my time." "Of course," Pubright smiled. "You've been there how long now?" 2 years. "So you'd have known who went in and out? Helpful in a lodging house?" Pubright leaned back. "Tell me, Mr. Pell, in your police days, did you ever deal with lost property? Trunks left at stations, that sort of thing?" all the time. I wonder, Pubright said idly, if one of those trunks could go missing for decades, only to appear again in a parish hall cupboard. Pell's head came up sharply, then down. Wouldn't surprise me, he muttered. People keep all sorts, sometimes better left kept. Pubright tilted his head. Sometimes better returned, perhaps. Something in Pell's face shifted, an almost imperceptible sag of the jaw, a flicker of memory. He took a long drink of tea and said, "Depends who it belongs to." "Quite," Pubright said, his voice still conversational. "And costumes, too, can belong to more than one story. Masks especially, they travel." He finished his scone with slow precision. "Well, I won't keep you. You've a shift to start, no doubt." Pell stood abruptly. "Yes. Long night." Pubright extended a hand. "Always a pleasure to talk about the past, Mr. Pell. It helps us understand the present." Pell shook it, his palms slightly damp. "Right, good day, Inspector." As the man left the buffet, Mally drifted over from the counter. "Looked a bit rattled, sir." "What did you say to him?" "Very little," Pubright said. He poured the last of the tea into his cup. "We discussed costumes, keys, lost property." Mally frowned. "You think he knows something?" "I think he knows more than he wishes to remember." Pubright glanced at the newspaper Pell had left behind. A faint smudge of charcoal darkened its edge. "Memory can be like dust, Mally. It clings to the fingers." Mally sat opposite. "What now?" "Now?" Pubright folded the paper and set it aside. "We wait. Sometimes a remark dropped in the right place makes more noise later than when it's spoken." He stood, placing coins on the table. Outside the window, a train slid into the platform with a hiss of steam. Passengers hurried by, glancing at the inspector without recognition. Pubright watched Pell's retreating back merge with the crowd and vanish toward Gloucester Street. Mally said softly, "You're not going to tell me what he let slip, are you?" Purbright's mouth twitched. "I'm not sure yet myself, but something moved. We'll see which way." He reached for his hat. "Come along, Sergeant. We've work to do." They left the buffet, the smell of tea and damp coats fading behind them, and stepped into the cool evening. The station clock showed 4:15. Across the square the town hall loomed, its masked statue now a little darker in the lowering light. Pubright glanced at it once, then set off at his steady pace, carrying with him a small, unspoken clue like a pebble in a pocket. Sunday afternoon brought a rare, brittle sunshine to Gloucester Street. Lace curtains trembled as neighbours pretended not to watch number 14, where Inspector Pubright had arranged what he described in his letter as a small gathering to clarify a misunderstanding. Mrs. Prowse had agreed only after he promised the matter would be concluded without fuss. She had set out her best china and a plate of currant buns, though her hands trembled as she placed the sugar tongs. At precisely 3:00, Pubright arrived with Sergeant Mally. Behind them came Mr. Simmons, the tax clerk, Miss Lee, the dressmaker, and Mr. Pell, his security uniform replaced by a dark suit that did not soften his ex-police bearing. All five crowded into the sitting room, whose faded chintz curtains filtered the sun into a polite glow. The clock on the mantel ticked with the same determination as at every other hour of Mrs. Prowse's life. Pubright declined tea at first, but accepted a cup when pressed. He waited until everyone had been seated. Simmons on the edge of a chair, Miss Lee braced like a ship's figurehead, Pell near the door as though considering escape. Mrs. Prowse herself sat upright on the sofa, chin lifted, eyes shifting between the inspector and her lodgers. "Thank you all for coming," Pubright began in his mildest tone. It seemed best to discuss matters together rather than in fragments. We've had 2 masks appear in our town in as many weeks. People have called them pranks.
Others threats?
I thought we might examine their story more closely. He placed a small box on the low table. Inside lay the first mask from the flower show, chalk white and crimson. Next to it he set a photograph of the second, still on Sir Godfrey Tuttle's statue. The effect was theatrical, like props ready for a cue. These, Pubright continued, are not modern creations. They're vintage props from a play called The Masked Lover, last performed in Flaxborough 25 years ago by the Amateur Dramatic and Operatic Society. You may recall the society was dissolved abruptly after irregularities in its funds. The costumes were supposed to be stored, then sold. He glanced round the room. Not all were. Miss Lee gave a small gasp, quickly disguised as a cough. Mr. Simmons adjusted his tie. Mr. Pell stared at the carpet. Pubright went on, still gentle. The late Mr. Prowse, I discovered, was the custodian of some of those costumes, including these masks. A minor matter, perhaps, but the society's missing money was never accounted for. There were rumours, unfounded of course, about certain committee members. Time passed. People moved on. Mrs. Prowse's lips tightened. My husband kept nothing that wasn't his, she said quietly. I'm sure he believed that, Pubright replied. But these masks have been taken from the past and brought into the present. Someone placed them where they would disturb you, Mrs. Prowse. First under the cake stall, then on the statue. Not to amuse the town, but to unsettle you. Perhaps to warn you against speaking of what you know. She looked down at her folded hands. I've said nothing, she murmured. That, Pubright said softly, is what the person responsible wished to ensure. He turned slightly toward Mr. Pell. A retired constable knows how rumours work. Mr. Pell, he also knows how to move quietly, how to place objects without being seen.
How to borrow keys without signing for them. Pell's jaw moved, but no words emerged. Pubright continued, conversational as ever.
You lodged here once before, didn't you? Briefly in the 1950s before you joined the police. You'd have known about the trunk.
Known what was inside? Pell's eyes flicked to Mrs. Prowse, then back to the inspector. That was a long time ago. Yes, Pubright said.
Long enough for memories to seem safe. But then the trunk surfaced again, perhaps during a clear-out, and Mrs. Prowse, strict landlady though she is, might have begun to suspect old stories still had teeth. So you tried to frighten her, not harm her, into silence.
A mask at the flower show, another on the statue to show reach and nerve. A warning rather than an attack. Miss Lee let out a short, triumphant breath.
Mr. Simmons looked as if he might vanish into his chair. Mrs. Prowse's eyes closed for a moment, then opened, glistening. Pubright set his teacup down. But fear, Mr. Pell, is an unreliable servant. It draws attention. The second mask especially required planning and access to the town hall. A key, perhaps, borrowed during your security rounds. And when we spoke at the buffet, you let slip that Mrs. Prowse didn't always have the only key to the trunk.
A small remark, but telling. Pell shifted in his seat, shoulders squaring as though for a reprimand.
I never took a penny, he said at last, voice low. I've made no such accusation, Pubright said. I merely observed that you feared discovery. The masks were your way of discouraging questions.
Unfortunately, they've done the opposite. Silence filled the room.
The clock ticked. A bus rumbled past outside. Miss Lee stared at Pell with a seamstress's satisfaction. Mr. Simmons coughed into his handkerchief. Mrs. Prowse kept her gaze on the floor, but a small tremor in her hand betrayed something like relief. Pell looked up at Pubright, the fight gone from his expression. What happens now? That, Pubright said gently, depends on you. You can make a full statement explaining the provenance of the masks and your actions, and we will decide whether any offence has been committed beyond mischief and intimidation. Or you can continue the charade and let the town supply its own ending. Pell exhaled slowly, a man setting down a heavy bag.
I'll talk, he said.
But I want it on record I never stole from the society. Pubright inclined his head. Noted, he turned to Mrs. Prowse. You've had an unpleasant few days, madam.
I hope this will ease your mind. She gave a small, brittle laugh. In Flaxborough?
Minds are never at ease, Pubright smiled faintly.
True, but at least the props are back where they belong. He closed the box over the mask, rose, and thanked her for the tea.
As he guided Pell toward the door, the man's shoulders slumped, and in that slumping was all the admission needed. Pubright said nothing more. The pieces had aligned. There was no need to hammer them into place. In the hallway, Mally whispered, "That's it then, sir?" "Almost," Pubright said, glancing back at the sitting room where Mrs. Prowse sat very still, hands folded on her lap. "But endings are best served quietly." He stepped outside into the thin sunshine, Pell walking heavily beside him, and closed the door with a soft click. Monday morning broke mild and pale over Flaxborough, the kind of light that softened stone and blurred the edges of memory. Outside number 14, Gloucester Street, a small van idled discreetly at the curb. No sirens, no cuffs. Only 2 uniformed constables and Inspector Pubright stood at the door, while Mr. Pell, hatless but composed, stepped out carrying a small overnight bag. His dark suit from the tea-gathering had been pressed again.
As if neatness could armour him, there were onlookers.
Of course, neighbours behind curtains, a boy on a bicycle pretending to adjust his chain, the dressmaker from next door pausing dramatically with her milk bottles. Yet no one shouted or jeered. Flaxborough did not stage scenes when it could script them silently. The ex-constable's face showed no fight, only the faint resignation of a man who had once enforced the law and now submitted to it. Pubright spoke briefly to him at the van door. "We'll take your statement at the station."
No hurry. Pell nodded once, then climbed inside.
The vehicle pulled away without fuss, its tyres whispering over damp cobbles. Curtains fluttered shut along the street. Inside the house, Mrs. Prowse stood in the hallway, hands clasped round her apron. She had insisted on making tea for the officers before they left, a gesture of dignity if not hospitality. Her voice, when she spoke, had acquired a new firmness, as though something long coiled had straightened. "I should like the trunk removed from the attic," she told Mally crisply. "Everything in it sent to the solicitor Inspector Pubright mentioned. It's past time." "Yes, madam," Mally said, a little surprised by her briskness. When the policeman departed, she closed the door with a sharp click and went to the kitchen. There she began scrubbing the already clean sink, lips pressed together, eyes brighter than before. The lodgers kept to their rooms, feet quiet on the stairs. Miss Lee hummed softly while pinning a hem. Mr. Simmons rustled his newspaper with exaggerated interest. Life in number 14 resumed its rhythm, but the tempo had changed, like a tune played in a new key. By midday, the Flaxborough Chronicle had its headline, "Masks Linked to Old Drama Society. Local Man Questioned." The photograph beneath showed the town hall statue, now barefaced again, a municipal worker wiping away traces of glue. Councillor Harbottle's prepared statements had been trimmed to a single paragraph of deploring antics and confidence in the authorities. The article's tone was sober, almost disappointed, as if the story had ended before it could become properly scandalous. In the railway buffet, patrons discussed the news with the air of people packing away props after a show. "Knew it was someone in the house all along," said one. "Always the quiet ones." Another shook her head. "Poor Mrs. Prowse, but she's tougher than she looks." The mask episode, so recently the centre of speculation, already slid down the conversational ladder to make room for fresher material. A rumour about the vicar's car, a price rise at the butcher's. Flaxborough's appetite for novelty was keen but brief. Pubright, back at his desk, flipped through Pell's preliminary statement without expression. It contained no great revelations beyond what he had already deduced, no embezzlement proved, only fear of old rumours and a misguided attempt to silence them. He placed the papers in a file marked miscellaneous and reached for his teacup. The tea had gone cold again. Sergeant Malley appeared in the doorway. "All settled at the station, sir."
Pell's cooperating.
"Says he only meant to scare her. We've charged him with harassment and unlawful entry. He'll get a caution at most." Pubright nodded. "Good." Malley hesitated.
You're not disappointed, sir, after all the masks?
"Disappointed?" Pubright raised his brows slightly. "Not at all. A little human drama, a little stagecraft, and a quiet ending. Very Flaxborough." He smiled faintly. "Besides, outcomes rarely match the public's appetite. They match people." Malley grinned. "Mrs. Prowse looks different, stronger." "Adversity can act like starch," Pubright said. "Stiffens the fabric." He gestured toward the window.
Keep an eye on the square.
"If any more masks appear, we'll know this was only the dress rehearsal." Malley left, still smiling. The inspector leaned back, watching a pigeon on the sill shake rain from its feathers. The town beyond moved on with its small intrigues and steady habits. Gossip would shift to the next subject, Harbottle would find a fresh outrage, and number 14 would return to its routines with a slightly altered hierarchy. Pubright felt the faint amusement of a man who has seen the pattern before and expects to see it again. He reached for a blank report form and began to write in his spare hand. Enquiries concluded. Outside, the drizzle ceased, leaving the square washed and ordinary. Sir Godfrey Tuttle's statue stood bare and unremarkable, as if it had never worn horns at all. Pubright signed his name, blotted the ink, and turned to the next folder in his in-tray. The rhythm of paperwork resumed like the tick of Mrs. Prowse's mantel clock. Another small performance ended, another already beginning somewhere else in Flaxborough. He lifted his cold tea, sipped, and allowed himself a small private smile at the constancy of human nature.